Okay, let me just go back a few bits. Right, so thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone can see my screen and can see the slides. If you just get a few nods just to see that that's the case. Thank you very much, Mr. Deshmukh, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be presenting to you this evening on this topic, which I think is of great interest and importance to everyone. It's a huge topic, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and I'll only be touching on a few different areas that I think are of interest and of debate and discussion. But hopefully it will spark a bit of interest into how we're going to face these big challenges that that lie ahead of us as the world. So I guess the first question we could pose is, what's the problem? We live in a kind of bucolic, green and pleasant land to many eyes. And if you flick to the National Trust brochures, or you look at the various national parks, we see lots of pictures like this. And you might think, well, there can't be a problem in the UK. Those problems are elsewhere. But I think there is a problem, and I think there's things that we need to address about it. And just to couch the problem in a much larger global scale, we can see that we really are in the climate emergency. This graphic, along with many other graphs, etc., show just how deeply we're into an area of unprecedented global warming that is predicted at the current levels to rise at least 2.5 degrees by the middle of this century, but may go as high as 4.5 degrees by the end of the century, and we're probably unable to stop it going to less than 1.5 degrees by 2050. So we know we're in a climate emergency, and that's obviously at the top of the agendas, both in the news that we see every day, but perhaps slightly less well known is that we are also in a biodiversity crisis. So, sorry, my screen's not quite moving on. Not quite sure why that's the case. Give me 2 seconds. Oh, there we are. We're in a biodiversity crisis. I would say that if you look at the numbers, we really are entering the sixth mass extinction. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that the rate of loss of biodiversity is exceeding by 1,000-fold the background rate of extinction. We know that extinction is a natural process. Species go extinct and are created all the time, but there is a constant rate for that to occur, or a natural rate for that to occur. And when that is exceeded over a very short period of time, we term that a mass extinction event. And now, of course, we're familiar with the mass extinction events in the end of the Cretaceous period that caused the age of the dinosaurs to end. And there are 4 previous mass extinction events to those, including things like the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, all thought to be due to different causes, such as asteroids hitting the Earth, or significant, huge volcanic eruptions causing massive climate change. But perhaps what is unique about this current mass extinction is that wildlife is declining, as we can see here, massively quickly. And this is only over the last 35 to 40 years. We can see that wildlife is really plummeting in both biodiversity and also biomass. And this is all really to do with human change. And the reason that that's important is that, coupled with climate change, biodiversity is incredibly important for the functioning of ecosystems. And this map here shows the world, with the red zones representing areas where biodiversity has been lost beyond safe limits and has caused the breakdown of the ecosystems. And when we have the breakdown of ecosystems, we then have the breakdown of natural services that ecosystems provide, which are clean water, oxygen, production of soil, and then the production of all the other services like timber, fiber, protein, fruits that ecosystems provide, as well as those less tangible benefits, of course, which are beauty, recreation, and interest, as well as scientific discovery. So I think it's very clear to say that we are truly in the age of the Anthropocene. Man's footprint on the planet is enormous. It is potentially, or it has been devastating, and it potentially becomes even more devastating. And it's a result of man-made change causing climatic change and causing devastating biodiversity loss and biomass loss. So that rather bleak picture brings us on to what are the environmental impacts of food and agriculture. And we can see here that in each of these domains, in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, land use, freshwater use, the pollution of fresh water in the world's oceans, and in particular, biodiversity loss, the impact of food and agriculture is absolutely enormous. And if we go back to the second column on this chart here, we can see that its enormous impact is primarily due to the fact that 50% of the global habitable land is used for agriculture. So we should ask ourselves the question very clearly: how should we use that land most effectively and efficiently to provide food for humans, but also to prevent huge amounts of biodiversity loss and to minimize the impact of agriculture in its contribution to climate change? So to bring things a bit closer to home, we can ask the question about the UK, because as I posited at the start of this talk, the UK, we perhaps think of it as slightly isolated from these events, and perhaps we think that these are events that are occurring elsewhere, perhaps in the tropics, and in other areas where we see biodiversity loss on a greater scale. And there's a couple of reasons that we need to think about this. Number one, the UK is one of the most changed environments in the entire world. Obviously, from our long history of colonization, since the last ice age 12,000 years ago, there's been increasing human populations and significant impacts upon the UK, particularly in terms of natural forest loss. But I think what's really important to note is not only is the UK a man-made landscape, but we're changing that man-made landscape even from its massively nature depleted state. So as you can see here, we actually lost a significant amount of tree cover in the UK, which doesn't have very much tree cover to start off with, over the past 20 years. And then if we look a little bit closer to home and think about what's happening in our farmland, so we've gone from this state of sort of the wild with the native ecosystem of the UK all the way down to the changed farmland. And we can see here that even within our farmland, due to agricultural practices, there's been a huge decline in all biodiversity on UK farmland. And we can see that farmland birds have been particularly effective. If we look at this graph here, although all groups of birds have declined, we can see that particularly farmland birds have been particularly badly affected. So that indicates that in this time frame, which is from 1970 to 2015, we can see that there's been some change in agriculture, which has caused a dramatic decline in the abundance and diversity of farmland birds. And the three species pictures which I've shown here, which include the lapwing on the top right, the yellowhammer on the bottom right, and the grey partridge on the bottom left, are some of those birds that suffered the greatest losses, with up to 90% declines in these birds. And it wasn't too long ago that huge flocks of lapwings were widespread and common, particularly in the eastern part of the country. That flocks of buntings, such as the yellowhammer, but other buntings as well, were abundant, particularly in winter, with flocks of thousands and thousands occurring on stubble fields and in hedgerows. And grey partridges were so widely abundant that they were shot in great numbers during game shooting. But these species have all incredibly greatly declined. And I'm afraid it's also moves down to even the smallest insects, and the most important perhaps, which are these pollinating insects, which don't just include the honeybees, which many would argue are actually a non-native species, but include the native pollinating species. And again, this incredibly diverse and important group has declined massively. So we can see that we've got an ashy mining bee on the top right, we've got a marmalade hoverfly on the bottom right, and a hummingbird hawk moth on the bottom left. And all of these groups, which are just, these are just a very obvious, a tiny sample of this incredibly but diverse and abundant group, that these have all suffered catastrophic decline. And the mammals, they're not exempt too. Well, we don't have any of the large megafauna that we perhaps would have had as a natural in the natural state of the UK that we may see in places like Sweden or Poland or even in Russia. But even our small mammals, such as the hedgehog, are suffering huge decline. And actually, most pertinently, the water vole, which has actually undergone a 94% decline due to changing agricultural practices, decline in water quality and the change in water management, and also the introduction of the American mink, which escaped from fur farms in the 50s and 60s, and then bred and spread, and has caused devastation to the water vole. So we might ask ourselves the question, what's changed? Here, I'd just like to show you a brief video from my grandfather's farm. And this video was taken in 1955. It's narrated by him, and it just shows a typical farm scene from late summer where they're collecting hay. So I'm just going to stop my share now and move on to reshare the video here. Just going to pause it for 2 seconds. Are you able to hear the commentary from my grandfather? If not, I can. I'll bring it in. If someone could just.
It's very quiet.
The commentary's quiet, is it?
Very quiet, yeah.
Okay, let me just turn it up, and then if it's not loud enough, I can just comment on it myself.
Left to dry, turns.
Yeah,
is
that
better? Okay. Okay, fine. So hopefully everyone can see the scene here. This is a hayfield. This is in 1955, and we'll just take a quick look at this, and then we might make a few comments on this later.
And pulled together before it was cocked in the field. And in those days, the cocks, it was always said that the hay was made on the cock, and they would be left in the field for several weeks before being put on the haystack. This is a photograph of the topplers which we used in those days, a very simple machine. I don't think there are probably many films of topplers being used today. One of the men who would ride the horse, and he would then direct which way he had to go, while the other operator walking behind would flick over the toppler when they had a rake full. It was a very good way of doing it, as a matter of fact, because the hay was relatively undisturbed, and the whole object of the haymaking in those days was to keep as much of the leaf on the clover as you possibly could. On the bottom of the handle, there was a small hook which hooked up onto the tines. And so when it was flicked, it went over the top. Quite an energetic exercise, as was all farm work in those days.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my presentation now. So yeah, I think what's quite clear is that a lot's changed in UK farming since my grandfather started farming. He actually started farming just after the war, and so that was in the first decade, really, when he was farming and taking over the farm from his father. We can see lots of things that have occurred there. Firstly, the hay cut, which was made late in the year when the grass was mature and had an opportunity to set seed. So this would be in July typically, or maybe even a little bit later into August, but typically in July. We can see that the hay was cut, it's raked, as you could see the farm workers with the horses doing there. And this whole process allowed a great diversity of flowering plants to coexist with the grass within the meadow. And this obviously supported a huge diversity of pollinating insects. It allowed the ground nesting birds, typically something like the grey partridge and the lapwing, which you could see in the previous, which I mentioned in the previous slides. It gave them time to breed and to rear their young, and also there were seeds available for the young seed-eating birds to eat. So that would be the young of the grey partridge, and also there would be seeds available for the foraging birds like the buntings, etc., in the autumn and winter time when food became scarce, and supported the offspring of those birds through the harsher winter months. So we went from a scene like you can see you can see demonstrated before you in this picture of a great diversity with at least 10 to 15 species of flowering plants and probably an equal species diversity of grassland plants in this one picture here, to a scene which is much more typical of today, which is a silage cut. And the silage cut here is obviously done with very powerful machines, but more importantly, it's done early in the year, so it may even start as early as April or May. This is important because it doesn't give the breeding birds an opportunity to nest and rear their young. Secondly, it's a monoculture, typically of Italian ryegrass, which doesn't give the species diversity in the flowering plants, and therefore the supporting the diversity of insects. And then, as we talked about, the seeds, and then also this is a highly fertilized and pesticide-driven industrial farming technique, which really allows very little space for any coexisting nature. And this is just one example of an area that's changed radically over the past 50 to 60 years, with a concomitant severe decrease in biodiversity and a massive impact on diversity that we can see from the previous graphs that I demonstrated. But it's very fair to pose the question, we still need to produce food, and we need to produce food fairly, equitably, and provide for the rapidly increasing population. So whilst the UK's population has increased at a decreasing rate, it continues to increase. So we've got to support that population by providing food that's nutritious and provides for the needs of the nation. And actually, from farmers would say, well, we've done very well here. We're actually producing more food with less land than ever before. So the efficiency of food production has radically increased. So we're in a bit of a conundrum here. We're in a conundrum of massive biodiversity loss, but actually significantly increased agricultural efficiency. And this is one of the key cruxes to this question, and one of the reasons why this debate is so fascinating is we have to try and square this circle to allow biodiversity and to also to feed the nation, and then by further extension the planet. Now, one way we've increased production is to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and these have both a positive impact in increasing the crop yields massively, and probably the primary driver for that, for the previous graph you saw with the decreased agricultural land use per person. But they are an enormous contributor to greenhouse gases, and also they pollute themselves by both causing nitrogen pollution into fresh water, which causes eutrophication and then decrease in freshwater biodiversity, and also they cause a significant decrease in fungal biodiversity. They decrease the diversity of soils, and they cause certain types of grasses and a small number of weeds to be highly competitive and outcompete their others, and it leads to the loss of those very biodiverse areas of farmland that we saw previously from hay meadows. Also, there's been a significant increase in pesticide production and pesticide use, and that again is a massive driver for increased efficiency, or well, it is at least a driver for increased efficiency, but it does have a significant impact upon biodiversity. So we have to ask ourselves, can we do anything about it? And in particular, can we square this circle of feeding people, and the loss of biodiversity. And it's a very difficult question, but there are some people who are trying to do things, and there are various different proposals that have been made. So firstly, at the consumer level, we need to think about what we eat, and particularly what we eat in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions for whatever measure you wish to use, but in this case, for 100 grams of protein. And we can see in this case that that beef, red meat, prawns, and also dairy products are very significant contributors per 100 grams of protein to climate change, and not only climate change, as I intimated before, the use of land per 1,000 calories. So diets that are very high in red meat and very high in dairy products, and that may be characterized by a Western European diet or a North American diet, are significantly more damaging to the environment than those which are higher in that gain most of their protein from plant-based sources, such as legumes, peas, and also from nuts as well. So we can see here that one solution that could be proposed is to go for a plant-based diet, and we can see that there's a significantly decreased area of land use for the diet to supply your nutritional requirements if we take a diet that has no animal products in, and then compared to one which has, that has a typical Western European global diet. So I think that's a consideration we should be making in order to move to an increased use of a plant-based diet. And then we look on the producer's side. Well, there's a few things that should be said on the producer's side that link to the diets that we had before. Firstly, whilst we can see that the actual land use area for human food production, so that the land used to provide food that directly goes into the human diet, hasn't actually changed particularly significantly over that years. And in some cases, it may have even declined. What we can see has been very big is the production of land use for animal feed, and then also just sneaking at the top here there is the use of land for biofuels and other industrial uses. And I think very much on a very broad basis, the use of land for biofuels is something that we should really consider very carefully, and perhaps shouldn't be something that we should consider as a sustainable way of going forward, either to reduce our climate emissions, which is primarily what it's used for, or indeed to help to solve the problem of feeding the world. And actually, in this country, we're in a kind of ridiculous situation where farmers are being paid to plant maize, and all the maize fields we see around us, actually remarkably few of those are even going for animal feed, which I would argue is bad enough as it is. A lot of that's going for biofuel, and there's a double subsidy on that, and that's why farmers are taking that option. And who can blame them, really? They're running a business, they've got offers of 2 sets of money from the government, and so they're going to sell their maize, which is a very damaging crop in the UK for the soil, which I can go into in a little bit more detail if anyone wishes to know, but I won't go into detail now. It's an incredibly damaging crop for the soil in the UK, and we're just using that to make cheap industrial fuel, which really doesn't solve any problems. I think creates more problems actually than it solves. And so the sort of completely the other end of the spectrum is this scene. So this is a place called Knepp Wildlands. It's in Sussex, and this is an area that has been rewilded. And rewilding is a very, very fashionable and very it's a term that people are very keen to bandy about these days. And what rewilding means is that the land is left to its own devices, to nature-driven processes, and there is no intervention, or as little intervention as possible, from human sources, and it's simply allowed to do what it wants. And its proponents very justifiably in many cases point to the restoration of these species, which you can see here. So again, top right is the nightingale, bottom right is the turtle dove, and top left is the purple emperor butterfly. Species that in other parts of the country have radically declined, with the turtle dove having absolutely devastating declines from being a relatively common bird in the middle of the 20th century to now being a bird with a nearly 99% loss countrywide. Again, probably due to the changes in farming practices that I've touched on earlier. These are actually doing very well in places like Knepp. And this is a controversial area, like many of these things. People are arguing, why should you take land out of production for food and turn it over to wildlife? And Knepp actually is, in some cases, argued against from the other side. Then it's not a truly rewilded area. It's an area that is sort of farmed in a ranch land, a very extensive basis, with the introduction of many non-native species that are used as analogues of the megafauna, which are now extinct. So we can see here some Exmoor ponies, which act as browsers in their ecosystem. They also have English longhorn cattle, they have Tamworth pigs. So none of these are actually truly wild species, but they are ancient breeds which they're using as analogues of the wild species to provide an ecosystem service and maintain the or increase the biodiversity by creating patches in the environment which allow a great diversity of species to exist. So that's a controversial area, and they do actually sell the meat from the cows and the pigs, but as you can imagine, it's not a particularly efficient system. So whilst I think it's very good for wildlife, and it does provide some significant resources outside of the production of food, such as these people in the van there having a sort of English safari, it's perhaps not a good solution for the production of food. But then we move on to something very interesting here, some integrated systems. So this is an agroforestry system whereby your typical cereal field, which may be many hundreds of acres in extent, particularly in areas of the east of the country, such as Cambridgeshire, with incredibly low biodiversity, which many ecologists would describe as a green desert, so low is its biodiversity. And we can see here that there's an integrated system here of fruit trees with then a wildflower kind of bank, and then the main cereal crop. And this is very interesting because this has both food production and biodiversity benefits, with pollinators and insects being supported by the banks, and food production on two levels being supported by the trees and also by the traditional cereal crop. So this is something that may well be a model for the future. And it's actually been, and then this is another model here, and this is called no-till farming. And this is a method of food production whereby there is no ploughing of the soil. Now, ploughing of the soil and turning over of the soil can cause great damage to the soil, even though it is obviously one of the most traditional methods of farming. And actually, this is a modern method of using these incredibly large machines that you can see here, whereby your previous crop is not removed from the soil, but it is actually just planted through, and then the previous crop is rolled over or actually sprayed off with a herbicide once the new crop is established. And it's thought by maintaining the roots in the soil and preventing the disturbance of the soil with the plough and the cultivators and all those agricultural machines, that actually you maintain increased soil carbon and increased soil biodiversity. So again, this may be an element of the solution to the biodiversity and food problems that we're faced. Now, I think this has perhaps quite limited benefits to biodiversity. It probably has quite significant benefits to soil carbon storage and climate change, and therefore the impact of farming on climate change. But one really good thing about this process is it does actually have very high yields, with the yields being pretty much equivalent in many cases to more traditional modern intensive farming methods. And then finally, we have this integrated system, and this is a picture of what appears to be very, very typical English countryside, and that's really the point. This is RSPB's Hope Farm in Cambridgeshire, which is run specifically on a for-profit basis, using a mix of agricultural techniques that are be familiar with most modern farmers. But with just a few tweaks and considerations for nature in order that they can both maximize biodiversity, maximize food production, and maintain a profitable farm. And there's just a few things to note in this picture, which all contribute to the improvement in biodiversity. You may see that there's 3 square patches in the field of cereals, which it looks like wheat crop in the far part of the picture. And these are to allow ground nesting birds, in particular skylarks, areas to nest in. And also areas to feed. And this simple way of allowing skylarks into the field just by lifting the seed drill up while you're going through your normal process of drilling can massively increase biodiversity. You'll also notice the hedges are perhaps a little bit more wild and unruly than you may see typically if you drive around the countryside. And these hedges have been left predominantly uncut and on a 20-year cycle of actually hedge laying. And this again promotes a massively increased biodiversity with large trees, with the berries and the flowers that the hedges produce, and all of the niches that allow animals to feed, to shelter, and to reproduce, which again increases the biodiversity of the farm. And then finally, you can see in the foreground, just in front of the hedge, that there's patches of flowers. So they've left fairly significant verges, which again provide all the benefits as you'd expect from from a sort of small wildflower meadow just on the inside of the hedge. And what's really interesting here is that the increase in biodiversity of insects actually means that they have to use less inputs in many cases, in particular pesticides, because there's a significant increase in the predatory insects that are available. So we can see that their results, they've got a massively increased farmland bird index. They've got both increased biodiversity of farmland birds and also increased biomass of farmland birds against a continuing downward trend in England as a whole. And all of this needs to be backed up with policy, because this is really how farmers change. And it may be that the recent environmental land management aspect of the new agricultural policy that the government has released is one way in which this green agenda and these environmental services from farms are going to be pushed into mainstream farming culture. So that's the end of my presentation. Many thanks for listening. I hope there was something interesting there. Yeah, I'd be very happy to take any questions